At one of my former assignments, I received a call one day from a fellow, an elderly man, telling me that he hadn't been feeling well if I'd be good enough to take communion to his home on a regular basis. I said, sure. So he gave me his address, got to his house, and when I got to his home, I noticed something very interesting. Between his house on the left and his neighbor's house on the right, there was a fence that went from one end to the other. Now I noticed that the fence did not travel around the other three sides of his yard or the other three sides of his neighbor's yard. So when I saw that fence dividing the property, I said to myself, oh, there's a land war going on here. These two are getting along well. So he invites me into his house, and it was a beautiful summer day just like this one, and we went outside to sit on his porch. We're sitting on his porch. I could tell quickly he was originally from Italy. We're sitting on his porch, and his neighbor walks out on his porch. And all of a sudden, they look at each other, and they start yelling and cussing each other. I didn't know what was going on. They were saying stuff in Italian. I had no idea what they were saying, but I recognized a few of those words because they were the same words my grandfather would use whenever he was upset about something. So fortunately, his neighbor went back into his house, and I calmed the man down, and I said to him, well, what's going on? Now he explained to me the fight he had with his neighbor, this incredible fight. And I said to him, well, I didn't hear about that fight. Did the fight happen last night? No. Did the fight happen this morning? No, he said. And I said, well, when did the fight happen? And this was his answer. He said, the fight happened back in 1934 over in Italy. 1934. And I said to him, I find two things absolutely amazing. One, that you guys have been fighting since 1934. That's amazing. I also find it amazing that you two were neighbors in Italy. You travel 6,000 miles to the United States. How do you wind up being neighbors again? How does that happen? Now, about 3 months after that visit, the man died. And 4 days after he died, his neighbor died. His neighbor died. And I thought to myself, when I did the first man's funeral, then the other fellow, he also turned out to be Catholic, acting like that. But when he died 4 days after his neighbor died, I thought to myself, you know, these guys acted like mortal enemies, but they were both lonely men. They both needed each other. They looked forward to seeing each other, despite the fact they would yell at each other, but maybe that's what kept the blood flowing in their veins, just to see each other. And I think that's the key point of today's gospel reading. This is a very challenging gospel. So what we want to do, the gospel is coming out of the 10th chapter of Luke, verses 25 to 37. We want to take a look at verse 36 to see if we can pick up what the theme of concern happens to be in this gospel reading. Let's look at verse 26. 10th chapter of Luke. Now he, that's a reference to Jesus, said in reply, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Now, when you look at that, can you determine at this early point what the main theme of concern just might be for this gospel reading? Now, if you're looking there, you're probably coming out with a few themes, and that'd be right, because that verse, 26, there are a lot of themes stirring. So what we need to do is take a look at another verse to try to pinpoint what the theme might be in this gospel reading. Let's take a look at verse 29, 10th chapter of Luke. Now a scholar of the law said to Jesus, and there it is, and who is my neighbor? Now, a word is used here in verse 29 that was also used in verse 26, and that then becomes the theme of concern. What do you think the theme of concern happens to be in verse 29, verse 26, the entire gospel? Any idea? Neighbor, you're exactly right. Jesus wants to show us and educate us not only how we should treat our neighbor, but who our neighbor is. You always have to determine who's my neighbor. Once I know who my neighbor is, then I have to try to figure out how am I supposed to treat my neighbor. Now, what Jesus does from this point forward, he tells a story. Now, I'm not going to reread the gospel reading, but I'm just going to recap the story. This man fell prey to robbers. One of the robbers stripped him. Another robber beat him, leaving him half dead. A priest walking down the path ran across this beaten man and he goes around him, crosses to the opposite side, he keeps going. A Levite stumbles across this beaten man. He sees him. A Levite is also a priest. He goes around the beaten man to the opposite side. He keeps going. A Samaritan stumbles upon this man. He stops, and he takes care of the fellow. Now then, Jesus asked a very important question. Let's take a look at verse 36, the question Jesus asked. Jesus said to the crowd of people he's talking with, which of these three? That's the priest, the Levite, who's also a priest, the Samaritan. Which of these three, in your opinion, was neighbor to the man who fell in with the robbers? Now, what's your early answer to that point? Samaritan. How many people think it was a Samaritan? Yes. I mean, the priest, the Levite takes off. The Samaritan took care of his needs. But we want to take a look at what is the answer that Jesus is. Now, the disciples give Jesus an answer, but he responds to the answer. Let's look at verse 37. When Jesus poses this question, this is the early answer. The answer is the one who treated him with compassion. As you all said, that was the Samaritan. That's the one that treated this man with compassion. And Jesus said to him, then go and do the same. That's how we are to treat our neighbor. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, guess what, Father Ken? My house is situated on 10 acres. We don't have any neighbors. No neighbors to contend with. Or you might say to yourself, we live on a corner lot. Now we only have one neighbor to contend with, not two like everyone does when you live on the interior of a street. Most of the time you have two neighbors. Who's your neighbor? So I said to myself, as I want to try to figure out what that answer is, I turned to Webster's dictionary to find out what is the definition of neighbor. And this is Webster's definition. Let's take a look. Neighbor, according to Webster. A person who is living next to another person at any given moment. Take a look at that. A person who is living next to another person at any given moment. Right now in church this morning, you're sitting next to a new neighbor. Now maybe immediately to the left or to your right might be your wife or your husband or maybe your children, your family. But just beyond, if you're lucky enough and fortunate enough to be sitting with family, just beyond your family, the person just beyond your family, who is that person? That's your neighbor. That's your new neighbor. That's going to be your neighbor for the next 35 minutes and 25 minutes if I cut the thing short. That's your neighbor. That's been your neighbor for the last 25 minutes since you plopped in your pew. What Jesus is saying is something would happen to that neighbor of yours, that person in your pew, he would want you to address their needs right now. Not to look around and try to figure out who's going to do it. Jesus is saying that's your neighbor. When you're at Giant Eagle and you're pushing your grocery cart down the aisle and someone's coming down the aisle from the opposite direction, when you nearly get parallel to each other at that very moment in time, that person, probably a stranger, someone you might never seen before, someone you've seen before, but you know they live around here, but you know what their name is. At that very moment, you are neighbors to each other. Once you parallel each other and that person, for whatever reason, will collapse to the ground, what should you do? Grab your cart and move even quicker? No. If that person collapses, Jesus is saying, you stop, you do what the Samaritan did. You tend to that person's needs. How can I help you? Should I call the ambulance? And then if you do, you wait until the ambulance arrives, make sure they're secure and safe. See, who is our neighbor? And in a given day, our neighbor continually changes throughout the course of the day. Every human being we run across on a daily basis, for the moment they're right in front of us, next to us, in the vicinity of the area in which we are at, that is your neighbor. And if they need your help, Jesus said you're to offer them help. Now clearly when you watch the news at night, you read the paper in the morning, or whatever you do, and you see all this hatred and violence, clearly there's a lot of understanding of who our neighbor is. Every human being, despite their race or the color of their creed. Every human being bleeds the same color. Every human being puts their pants on one leg at a time. When we understand that that person then becomes our neighbor, that's our brother, that's our sister, that's our neighbor when I'm next to that person, then Jesus Christ is saying that you must, if you need to, which you should always, treat that neighbor with compassion and respect. What a powerful gospel. It's so embarrassing that the priest and Levite just keep going. No, that's Jesus. And that's not what being a Christian is all about, to run away and hide, not to render assistance. What it takes to be a Christian, and this is the sacrifice of it all, because you might say to yourself, when I ran to the store, I got to be back in 10 minutes, and now this guy went on and collapsed. And if I take care of him, I'll never get to the store, never get back home. But Jesus is saying, sometimes in life, priority demands that you stop and you take care of the neighbor. What a powerful ending, verse 36, 37, the 10th chapter of Luke. In your opinion, Jesus says, which one of those three was neighbor to the man who fell victim to the robbers? And the answer was the one who treated him with compassion. And the ending phrase that Jesus uses is what he uses for all of us this morning. The one who treated with compassion. And Jesus says, and this is our challenge in life, every day forward from this point, then quickly go and do the same. Treat your neighbor with compassion, respect, and kindness.